Some people leave behind fortunes. Others leave behind mysteries. The church bells of Pine Ridge rang slowly beneath a sky the color of cold silver. Their sound drifted across the valley and disappeared into the mountains beyond town. Caleb Foster stood near the back of the cemetery with his hands buried deep inside the pockets of his weathered jacket. The late October wind carried the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and distant chimney smoke. It was the kind of mountain air that seemed older than memory itself. Beside him sat Scout, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose sable coat rippled gently in the breeze. The dog remained unusually quiet, his amber eyes fixed on the gathering of mourners surrounding a simple wooden casket. Caleb had not been back to Pine Ridge in nearly 12 years. Life had carried him elsewhere. Military service, deployments, temporary jobs scattered across several states. One rented apartment after another, one year blending into the next. Yet somehow the town looked exactly the same. The white church still overlooked the valley. The old diner still stood across from the feed store. Even the mountains seemed frozen in time, watching silently from every direction. But one thing had changed forever. His grandmother was gone. Eleanor Foster had lived alone on the mountain for nearly 3 decades. Most people in town knew her only as the quiet old woman who came into town every Friday morning for groceries and church. She rarely talked about herself, rarely attended community events, rarely invited visitors to her cabin. Over time, people stopped asking questions. They assumed she preferred solitude. They assumed they knew her story. Standing among the mourners, Caleb realized he knew surprisingly little about it himself. The pastor's voice floated softly through the cold air. Stories were shared, memories exchanged, kind words spoken. Yet something felt incomplete. Almost every person described Eleanor the same way. Quiet, private, reserved, as though her entire life could be summarized in a handful of simple adjectives. Caleb glanced down at Scout. The German shepherd's ears twitched slightly. The dog seemed focused on something. Beyond the ceremony itself, beyond the people, beyond the voices. Almost as if he sensed something hidden beneath the surface of the day. The service ended shortly before noon. One by one, people drifted toward their vehicles. Conversations resumed. The normal rhythms of life began returning. Caleb lingered near the grave long after most had left. A thin layer of clouds moved slowly across the mountains overhead. Fallen leaves tumbled across the grass. He stared at the fresh earth in silence. His grandmother had written him letters for years. Birthday cards, holiday notes, small updates about life in Pine Ridge. He always meant to visit more often. There always seemed to be time. Until there wasn't. "I am sorry it took me so long," he whispered. The wind carried the words away. Scout rose to his feet and gently pressed against Caleb's leg. The simple gesture grounded him, a familiar reminder that some forms of loyalty never ask for explanations. As Caleb turned toward the parking lot, he noticed a small group of townspeople gathered near the church steps. They were speaking quietly with an older man wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. The town attorney. Several heads turned toward Caleb before quickly turning away again. Strange expressions crossed their faces. Curiosity, surprise, something else he could not quite identify. Then the attorney began walking directly toward him. The man's polished shoes crunched softly across the gravel path. His expression remained polite but serious. When he finally stopped in front of Caleb, he adjusted his glasses and offered a small nod. "Mr. Foster," he said, "there is something your grandmother wanted you to hear before anyone else." The attorney introduced himself as Walter Hayes. He was a tall man in his 70s with silver hair, careful manners, and the patient voice of someone who had spent decades handling the private affairs of families in Pine Ridge. The mountain wind tugged gently at his coat as he opened the leather briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. Caleb immediately recognized the handwriting. The sight of it tightened something deep inside his chest. Eleanor Foster had always written, in neat blue ink with careful loops and steady lines. Even now, seeing his name written across the envelope felt strangely comforting. "Your grandmother instructed me to give this to you before the reading of her will," Walter said quietly. "She was very specific about that." Caleb accepted the envelope. The paper felt old but well preserved. Scout sat beside him, watching the exchange with calm attention. Around them, the cemetery continued to empty. Vehicles pulled away. Conversations faded. The mountains reclaimed their silence. Caleb carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it slowly and began reading. Caleb, if you are holding this letter, then I am finally home with your grandfather. I know you probably have questions. Most people do. There is only one thing I need you to remember today. Listen carefully to what they say. Then listen carefully to what they do not say. The truth is usually hiding between the two. Love always, Grandma. Caleb read the letter twice. It was short, almost frustratingly short. Yet something about it lingered in his thoughts. Listen carefully to what they do not say. Walter quietly closed his briefcase. The family will be gathering at the town hall in 1 hour. Caleb nodded. For the will. Yes. The attorney hesitated briefly. Your grandmother made several unusual requests. Before Caleb could ask what that meant, Walter offered a polite smile and walked away. By early afternoon, the old town hall was nearly full. Sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking the valley. Dust floated through the beams of light. Pine Ridge was not a large town. Most people knew one another. Many had known Eleanor Foster for decades. Caleb sat near the back with Scout resting beside his chair. Several relatives occupied the front rows. Cousins, distant family members, people he had not seen in years. Some nodded politely. Others barely acknowledged his presence. A low hum of conversation filled the room until Walter stepped forward and cleared his throat. Silence followed. The reading began. Personal belongings were distributed first. Jewelry, furniture, family photographs, savings accounts. Various items passed to relatives and charitable organizations. Everything seemed straightforward, predictable. Then Walter reached the final pages. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. To my grandson Caleb Foster, he read, adjusting his glasses, I leave sole ownership of my mountain cabin and all land directly attached to the property. A murmur swept through the room. Caleb remained still. Several relatives exchanged confused glances. One cousin actually laughed under her breath. The mountain cabin. Everyone knew the place. It sat nearly 8 miles outside town on a steep ridge overlooking the valley. Remote, aging, difficult to access during winter. Most people considered it more burden than blessing. Walter continued reading legal details, but Caleb barely heard them. Across the room, reactions spread quietly. Some looked relieved they had not inherited the property. Others seemed amused. One relative leaned toward another and whispered something that caused both to smile. Scout lifted his head. His amber eyes moved slowly across the room as though observing every expression. Then Walter closed the folder. The reading was over. Chairs scraped against wooden floors. Conversations erupted almost instantly. Yet before anyone could approach him, Walter spoke once more. There is one final instruction from Eleanor Foster. The room fell silent again. Walter opened a second envelope and read aloud. Tell Caleb this. The cabin knows the truth. No explanation followed. No additional details. Just those 6 words. And suddenly every person in the room seemed as confused as Caleb himself. The 6 words followed Caleb everywhere for the rest of the afternoon. The cabin knows the truth. They echoed in his thoughts as he walked through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge with Scout pacing beside him. The town looked exactly as he remembered. Weathered storefronts, pickup trucks parked along Main Street, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the diner near the courthouse. Yet now everything seemed slightly different, as though an invisible thread connected every familiar place to a question nobody wanted to answer. Several townspeople offered polite condolences. As he passed, others stopped to ask whether he planned to keep the mountain property. Most seemed surprised when he admitted he had not decided yet. Their reactions were remarkably similar. Small smiles, shrugs, sympathetic expressions. The kind people reserve for someone they believe has inherited a problem rather than an opportunity. By evening, Caleb found himself sitting alone inside the diner overlooking the valley. Rain clouds had begun gathering over the mountains, turning the western horizon shades of gray and blue. Scout rested beneath the table, occasionally lifting his head whenever the front door opened. The smell of coffee, grilled onions, and warm bread filled the room. Across from him sat Walter Hayes. The attorney had requested one final conversation before Caleb left town. Your grandmother never talked much about the cabin, Caleb said. Walter stirred his coffee slowly. Not publicly, but privately. The older man hesitated. For a moment, his gaze drifted toward the mountains visible through the diner window. Eleanor believed some stories belonged to the people willing to find them. Caleb frowned. What does that mean? Walter smiled faintly. It means she was a very stubborn woman. The answer raised more questions than it resolved. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping against the glass. Pine trees swayed gently on the hillsides beyond town. Walter reached into his briefcase and removed a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. The tag contained only one word. Cabin. He placed it on the table. Your grandmother asked me to give you this after the reading. Caleb picked up the key. The metal felt worn smooth from years of use. What does it open? I honestly do not know. Walter leaned back in his chair, but Eleanor kept it with her for more than 20 years. Silence settled between them. The rain outside grew heavier. Scout shifted beneath the table and rested his head against Caleb's boot. The simple gesture reminded him of something important. He did not have to solve every mystery immediately. He only had to take the next step. An hour later, Caleb stood in the motel room he had rented for the night. Rain drummed steadily against the window. The brass key rested on the dresser beside his grandmother's letter. He stared at both objects for several minutes. Then he unfolded a road map of the area. The mountain cabin sat nearly 8 miles outside town along an old logging road that climbed high above the valley. He had not visited the property since he was a teenager. Back then, the cabin seemed enormous. Magical. A place where stories lived inside every corner. He wondered what it looked like now. Whether the porch still overlooked the western ridge. Whether the stone fireplace still stood. Whether traces of his grandmother remained inside. Scout suddenly rose from the carpet and walked toward the window. The German shepherd stared into the darkness beyond the glass. Caleb joined him. Far above the town, lightning flickered silently behind distant clouds. The mountains appeared as dark silhouettes against the storm. Somewhere beyond those ridges stood the cabin, waiting. The next morning, before sunrise painted the sky, Caleb loaded his bags into the truck. Scout jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation. The rain had passed during the night. Fresh mist drifted across the valley. As the engine started, Caleb glanced once more toward the mountains. For the first time since returning to Pine Ridge, he felt something beyond grief and confusion. Curiosity. And deep within that feeling, something else was beginning to grow. Hope. The logging road began where the pavement ended. Within minutes, Pine Ridge disappeared behind a curtain of towering evergreens and winding mountain turns. Caleb guided the old pickup steadily uphill while Scout sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the forest slide past the windows. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees in long golden shafts, illuminating patches of mist that still lingered from the previous night's rain. The air smelled cleaner here. Pine sap, wet earth, moss. It was the scent of childhood memories buried beneath years of distance. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no cell service, no signs of town life. Only the low rumble of tires on gravel and the occasional cry of a hawk, circling somewhere above the ridges. Nearly 40 minutes after leaving Pine Ridge, the road narrowed dramatically. Branches leaned overhead. Fallen leaves covered portions of the trail. Caleb slowed the truck as the forest closed around them. Then, without warning, the trees opened. The clearing appeared suddenly. He stopped the truck and stared. The cabin sat alone on the mountainside overlooking miles of untouched wilderness. For a moment, Caleb forgot to breathe. The place looked smaller than he remembered, yet somehow more beautiful. Morning sunlight rested across the roof like a warm blanket. Thin wisps of fog drifted through the valley below. The mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It felt less like a property and more like a forgotten corner of the world. Scout jumped from the truck immediately. The German shepherd landed softly and began exploring with obvious excitement. His nose worked constantly as he investigated scents carried by the mountain breeze. Caleb stepped out more slowly. The cabin showed its age. The porch leaned slightly on one side. Several shutters hung crooked. Moss covered portions of the roof. Yet the structure remained standing. Proudly, stubbornly, as though refusing to surrender to time. He walked toward the front steps. The boards creaked beneath his boots, but held firm. Every sound felt familiar. The rough grain of the handrail beneath his fingers. The scent of old cedar warmed by sunlight. The distant rush of water somewhere deeper in the valley. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Summer spent fishing nearby. Evenings listening to his grandmother tell stories beside the fire. Long nights watching thunderstorms roll across the mountains from this very porch. For a brief moment, grief softened into gratitude. Caleb removed the brass key from his pocket. The front door stood before him exactly as he remembered. Weathered. Simple. Solid. He slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. The door opened with a long, gentle creak. Cool air drifted outward, carrying the scent of aged wood, stone, and dust. Sunlight spilled through the windows, revealing a room frozen in time. The stone fireplace still dominated the far wall. A rocking chair rested beside it. Shelves lined with books stood exactly where they always had. Dust floated lazily through beams of light crossing the room. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing appeared abandoned. It felt as though Eleanor Foster had simply stepped outside for a walk and might return at any moment. Caleb entered slowly. Scout followed close behind. The dog paused near the center of the room and turned in a slow circle. His ears twitched. His eyes moved from wall to wall. Then something changed. The German shepherd stopped completely. A sudden stillness settled over him. Caleb noticed it immediately. Scout's gaze had locked onto the stone fireplace. Not the hearth. Not the chimney. A specific section of stone near the right side. The dog remained motionless for several seconds. Then he walked toward it, one step at a time. Careful, focused, curious. Caleb watched silently as Scout sat directly in front of the fireplace and stared. The room remained quiet except for the distant wind moving through the mountains outside. Then the dog tilted his head slightly and let out a low, thoughtful whine, as though he had noticed something nobody else had seen. For the rest of the afternoon, Scout refused to lose interest in the fireplace. Caleb unpacked supplies, opened windows, and carried dust-covered boxes from one room to another, yet every time he glanced across the cabin, the German shepherd was there, sitting, watching, waiting. The behavior was unusual, even for Scout. The dog was intelligent, observant, and occasionally stubborn, but he was not prone to fixating on random objects. Caleb finally walked over and knelt beside him. The stone fireplace rose nearly 7 feet high along the wall, built from rough mountain rock gathered decades earlier. He ran his hand across the cool surface. Nothing seemed unusual. No loose stones. No visible compartments. No obvious clues. Yet Scout continued staring at the same section near the right side of the hearth. "What are you trying to tell me?" Caleb asked quietly. The dog responded with a soft huff and rested one paw against the floor. The answer, if there was one, remained hidden. As daylight faded, Caleb shifted his attention toward making the cabin livable again. Dust covered nearly every surface. The kitchen cabinets needed cleaning. Several porch boards would eventually require replacement. The roof appeared sturdy enough for now, but another harsh winter could change that quickly. Hours passed in steady work. Outside, shadows stretched across the mountains. The forest slowly transformed from gold to deep blue. By sunset, the cabin felt noticeably different. Not restored, not even close, but alive again. Caleb lit several oil lamps he found stored in a cupboard and started a small fire in the fireplace. Dry pine logs crackled softly as warmth spread through the room. The familiar scent instantly transported him backward in time. Childhood evenings. Homemade soup. His grandmother reading near the fire while snow drifted past the windows. For the first time since arriving, the cabin felt less like an inheritance and more like home. Scout finally moved away from the fireplace and settled near the rocking chair. Caleb smiled, believing the mystery had passed. He was wrong. Sometime after midnight, a powerful gust of mountain wind rattled the cabin. Caleb woke immediately. Years of military service had trained him to notice changes in sound. The fire had burned low. Embers glowed softly inside the hearth. Moonlight filtered through the windows, painting silver patterns across the floorboards. Everything appeared normal. Then he heard it. A faint scratching sound. Not outside. Inside the cabin. Caleb sat up. Scout was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the fireplace, staring at the same section of stone. The scratching came again. Soft. Brief. Almost impossible to locate. Caleb grabbed a flashlight from the nearby table and crossed the room. Scout did not move. His attention remained fixed on the wall. The beam of light swept across the stones. Nothing. Caleb listened carefully. The scratching stopped. Silence returned. Only the wind remained. He exhaled and lowered the flashlight. Then Scout stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. The dog pressed his nose against a particular stone near the edge of the fireplace. Not the center. Not the hearth. One specific rock among dozens of nearly identical stones. Caleb examined it closely. At first glance it appeared no different than the others. But when he brushed away years of soot and dust, something emerged beneath the surface. A tiny carved symbol, so small it could easily be overlooked. A simple mountain surrounded by a circle. His heartbeat quickened. The mark did not appear accidental. Someone had placed it there intentionally. Someone wanted it to be found. Scout sat down beside him once more. The dog's amber eyes reflected the flashlight beam. Outside, the mountains slept beneath the stars. Inside, Caleb stared at the symbol and suddenly remembered his grandmother's final words. The cabin knows the truth. For the first time, he began to wonder if the cabin had been waiting for him all along. The mountain storm arrived 2 days later. Dark clouds rolled across the ridges before sunrise, swallowing the distant peaks and turning the valley below into a sea of gray mist. Wind rushed through the pines with a low, mournful sound that echoed across the mountainside. Caleb stood on the porch watching the weather move in while Scout sat beside him, ears raised toward the forest. The German shepherd seemed unusually alert. Ever since discovering the symbol carved into the stone, the dog had become even more attentive to the fireplace. It was as if he sensed the mystery was beginning to reveal itself. By midday, rain hammered the roof. The cabin groaned beneath powerful gusts sweeping down from the higher elevations. Inside, the fireplace crackled steadily, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning pine. Caleb spent most of the afternoon examining the marked stone. He tapped it gently, measured its position against the surrounding rocks, studied every inch of the hearth. Yet nothing obvious appeared. No hidden latch, no visible seam, no mechanism. The symbol remained the only clue. Frustration slowly began creeping into his thoughts. He had spent 3 days chasing a mystery that might not even exist. Maybe the carving was simply decorative. Maybe the scratching sound had come from the shifting cabin settling during the wind. Maybe grief was making him search for meaning where there was none. As evening approached, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against the windows. Branches scraped the roof overhead. The mountains vanished entirely behind curtains of cloud. Caleb sat near the fire holding his grandmother's letter. He read it again, then again. Listen carefully to what they say. Then listen carefully to what they do not say. The truth is usually hiding between the two. He lowered the paper and stared into the flames. Across the room, Scout suddenly stood. The dog walked directly to the fireplace and stopped. His body became rigid. His ears tilted forward. Caleb immediately noticed the change. What is it? Scout did not move. A few seconds later, a sharp gust struck the cabin. Something rattled deep inside the stone wall. Not outside. Inside. Caleb rose instantly. The sound came again. Brief. Hollow. Different from the noise of wind or settling wood. He grabbed a flashlight and crossed the room. Scout pressed his nose against the marked stone. The German shepherd let out a low whine. Caleb examined the rock carefully. Then, for the first time, he noticed something unusual. A narrow gap separated the marked stone from the one beside it. The opening was tiny, barely visible, yet it should not have been there. He slid his fingertips along the edge. The stone shifted slightly beneath the pressure. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he applied more force. Nothing happened. Then another powerful gust shook the cabin. The stone moved a fraction of an inch. Caleb froze. He grabbed a fireplace tool and carefully worked the edge. Dust fell onto the hearth. The stone shifted again. Scout stepped back, watching closely. For nearly 10 minutes, Caleb worked in silence while rain pounded the roof overhead. Finally, with a dull grinding sound, the rock slid inward. Cold air rushed from the opening behind it. Caleb directed the flashlight beam into the darkness. Hidden behind the fireplace was a narrow cavity built directly into the stone chimney. Inside rested a small wooden box covered in dust. Nothing else. Just the box. It appeared old. Very old. The kind of object that had remained untouched for decades. Caleb carefully reached inside and lifted it free. The wood felt surprisingly solid despite its age. A brass clasp secured the lid. No lock. No markings. Only years of silence. Scout sat beside him as thunder rolled across the mountains. The fire crackled softly nearby. Caleb stared at the box for several long moments. Then he slowly opened the lid. Resting inside was a folded journal wrapped in cloth, a black and white photograph, and a yellowed envelope with 6 words written across the front in his grandmother's familiar handwriting. For the one who finally listened. The storm lingered through the night, wrapping the mountains in darkness and rain. Wind rattled the cabin windows while the fire burned steadily inside the stone hearth. Caleb sat at the old wooden table with the box in front of him. Scout rested nearby, though his amber eyes remained fixed on the items spread across the tabletop. The German shepherd seemed calmer now, as if discovering the hidden compartment had fulfilled a purpose only he understood. Caleb carefully picked up the envelope first. The paper felt fragile beneath his fingers. Years of hiding behind stone had preserved it remarkably well. He unfolded the letter and immediately recognized his grandmother's handwriting. The words were steady and deliberate. If you found this, then you were patient enough to listen. Most people hear only what they want. Very few hear what remains unsaid. Caleb swallowed and continued reading. Eleanor explained that the cabin held more than family memories. It held part of the town's forgotten history. For decades, she had protected a truth that belonged not only to her family, but to everyone in Pine Ridge. She believed the right person would eventually uncover it. Someone willing to seek understanding instead of profit. Someone willing to stay. Caleb lowered the letter slowly. Rain continued tapping against the roof. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as though the past had quietly entered and taken a seat beside him. Next, he unfolded the black and white photograph. The image showed the cabin nearly 70 years earlier. Fresh lumber, a new roof, young pine trees barely taller than a person. Standing on the porch was a group of townspeople. Men, women, children. Nearly 24 people gathered together. Caleb recognized none of them except one. His grandmother. She appeared to be no older than 16. Smiling, standing near the center of the group. Yet something else immediately caught his attention. Written along the bottom edge of the photograph was a date. January 1958. Beneath it, a single sentence. The winter they survived. Caleb frowned. He had lived in Pine Ridge long enough as a child to know local history. Townspeople often spoke about floods, forest fires, and difficult winters. Yet he had never heard anyone mention an event called the winter they survived. The phrase felt important, significant, like the title of a chapter removed from a book. He turned toward the journal wrapped in cloth. The leather cover had darkened with age. When he opened it, a faint scent of old paper and cedar drifted upward. The first page contained only one sentence. Truth deserves witnesses. Caleb read the words twice. Then he turned the page. Journal entries filled the following pages. Names, dates, daily observations. At first they seemed ordinary. Weather conditions, food supplies, family notes. Then the entries changed. The winter of 1958 appeared repeatedly. Snowfall measurements, temperatures, warnings, mentions of roads becoming impassable. Entire sections described conditions growing worse week after week. Caleb found himself reading faster. Outside, thunder rolled softly beyond the mountains. Inside, the story unfolded. A historic storm had isolated Pine Ridge from the outside world for nearly 7 weeks. Supplies dwindled. Families struggled. Travel became impossible. Yet according to the journal, something extraordinary happened during that winter. Again and again, Eleanor mentioned people arriving at the cabin seeking shelter, food, and warmth. Dozens of names appeared throughout the pages. Some remained for days, others for weeks. The cabin became a refuge, a place of survival, a place where neighbors helped one another endure. Caleb stared at the growing list of names. Many belonged to families still living in Pine Ridge today. Yet nobody had ever spoken about this. Nobody. Scout suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the journal. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. A folded newspaper clipping had slipped loose from between the pages and fallen onto the table. The headline was faded but still readable. As he read the first line, his heart skipped. Because according to the article, the official story everyone believed about that winter was completely wrong. The newspaper clipping trembled slightly in Caleb's hands as another gust of wind brushed against the cabin. The storm was beginning to fade, but the mountains remained hidden behind thick clouds and drifting rain. Firelight flickered across the room, casting long shadows against the stone walls. Scout remained beside the table, watching quietly. Caleb lowered his eyes to the faded article. The paper had yellowed with age. Several sections were difficult to read, yet the headline remained clear enough. Mayor leads town through historic winter crisis. Caleb frowned. According to the article, the town's survival during the brutal winter of 1958 had been credited almost entirely to the mayor and a small emergency committee. Their names appeared repeatedly throughout the story. Their efforts were praised. Their leadership celebrated. Yet something felt wrong. Very wrong. The journal sitting beside him told a completely different story. He returned to its pages and continued reading. Entry after entry described desperate weather conditions. Snow drifts reaching 12 feet. Temperatures dropping below zero. Roads buried. Communication lines cut. Supplies running dangerously low. Yet the names mentioned throughout the journal were not politicians or town officials. They were ordinary people. Farmers. Teachers. Mechanics. Mothers. Children. Families arriving at the cabin exhausted and frightened. Families who found food, warmth, and shelter because Eleanor Foster and a handful of volunteers refused to turn anyone away. Caleb turned another page. Then another. The details became more remarkable with each entry. His grandmother had transformed the cabin into an emergency refuge. Neighbors shared food. Hunters brought meat from the mountains. Families slept on floors, couches, and makeshift beds. Entire weeks passed with dozens of people living together beneath the same roof. Yet according to the newspaper, none of it had happened. At least not officially. Caleb leaned back and stared at the fire. The contradiction made no sense. Why would such an important part of the town's history disappear? Why would nobody mention it? Scout suddenly stood and wandered toward the window. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped. Moonlight began filtering through breaks in the clouds. The German shepherd gazed toward the valley below. Caleb followed him a moment later. Through the glass, Pine Ridge appeared as scattered points of light far below the mountain. Generations of families still lived there. Some of the names from the journal still appeared on mailboxes, storefronts, and church pews. Yet somehow their shared story had vanished. He returned to the table and examined the newspaper clipping more closely. That was when he noticed a handwritten note scribbled along one margin. The ink had faded but remained readable. Eleanor's handwriting. Truth was traded for pride. Caleb read the words twice. Then a third time. A chill moved through him despite the warmth of the fire. He opened the journal again and continued deeper into the entries. Near the final pages, a folded document slipped free and landed on the table. Unlike the newspaper, this paper appeared official. A signed statement. Multiple signatures. Town records. Caleb unfolded it carefully. The document described a public meeting held months after the winter ended. Several prominent residents had agreed to simplify the official account of events. Certain details would be omitted. Certain contributions would remain unmentioned. The reason was never clearly stated. Yet one sentence appeared repeatedly throughout the document. Preserve the town's image. Caleb stared at the phrase in disbelief. Preserve the town's image. The truth had not been lost. It had been buried. Intentionally. Not out of cruelty. Not for money. But because people feared embarrassment. Feared controversy. Feared acknowledging how close disaster had truly come. The realization settled heavily. Across the room. For more than 60 years, the story of the winter had belonged to the wrong people. Scout returned from the window and rested his head against Caleb's knee. The simple gesture brought him back to the present. Caleb looked down at the German shepherd and smiled faintly. You knew there was something here, did you not? Scout's tail thumped softly against the floor. Outside, clouds slowly parted above the mountains. Inside, Caleb turned to the final pages of the journal. There, tucked carefully between the last entries, rested a sealed envelope addressed not to him, but to the people of Pine Ridge. The sealed envelope rested on the table between the journal and the fading firelight. For several minutes, Caleb simply stared at it. Outside, the storm had finally passed. Clouds drifted away from the mountains, revealing a sky crowded with stars. Moonlight spilled across the valley below, turning the distant rooftops of Pine Ridge into tiny silver shapes scattered among the darkness. Inside the cabin, everything felt still, quiet, as though the mountain itself was waiting. Scout lay beside the hearth, his head resting on his paws, though his eyes remained open. The German shepherd watched Caleb carefully. The envelope looked ordinary. cream-colored paper, slightly yellowed with age. Yet the words written across the front carried unexpected weight. To the people of Pine Ridge. Eleanor Foster's handwriting remained steady even after all these years. Caleb turned the envelope over. The seal had never been broken. Whatever message it contained had remained unread for decades. He carefully opened it. The paper crackled softly in the silence. Then he unfolded the letter and began reading. If this letter is ever opened, it means enough time has passed for truth to become more important than pride. Caleb immediately recognized the voice behind the words. Not just the handwriting. The tone. Calm. Patient. Honest. The same voice that had read him stories beside the fire when he was a boy. The letter explained what happened after the winter of 1958. When the roads finally reopened and life returned to normal, town leaders faced an uncomfortable reality. The official emergency plans had failed. Supplies had not arrived when promised. Several critical decisions had been delayed. Ordinary citizens had stepped forward to fill the gaps. Neighbors saved neighbors. Families helped families. The mountain cabin became an unofficial refuge that operated entirely through volunteer effort and community kindness. Yet when spring arrived, local officials feared that admitting those failures would damage public trust. So a simpler story emerged. One that focused on leadership instead of cooperation. One that celebrated authority instead of ordinary courage. Eleanor never described anyone as dishonest. She never expressed bitterness. In fact, the letter carried remarkable compassion. She understood why people made the choices they did. They wanted the town to heal. They wanted unity. They wanted to move forward. But in protecting reputations, they had buried something precious. The truth about what neighbors were capable of when they chose each other over themselves. Caleb lowered the letter and stared into the fire. The realization settled over him slowly. The hidden story was not about exposing villains. It was about restoring forgotten heroes. He continued reading. Near the end, Eleanor listed every family who had contributed during those 7 difficult weeks. More than 60 names filled the pages. Some donated food. Some shared firewood. Some opened their homes. Others carried supplies through snowstorms to reach stranded neighbors. Every contribution mattered. Every act of kindness was remembered. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Caleb's eyes. Not because the story was tragic, because it was beautiful. The kind of beauty people often overlook. Scout rose and quietly moved closer. The German shepherd rested his head against Caleb's leg. The simple gesture grounded him once again. As dawn approached, Caleb finished the final paragraph. The cabin was never important because it belonged to me. It was important because it belonged to everyone when they needed it most. He sat in silence long after the letter ended. Outside, the first pale hints of morning began appearing above the eastern ridges. A new day was arriving. Caleb looked toward the valley below and thought about the families still living there. Many probably had no idea their grandparents or great-grandparents appeared inside these pages. Many probably believed the official version of events because it was the only version they had ever heard. Then he remembered Walter Hayes, the attorney, the unusual instructions, the final message. The cabin knows the truth. Suddenly everything made sense. Eleanor never wanted the documents hidden forever. She wanted them discovered by someone willing to understand them first. Someone willing to protect the truth before sharing it. Caleb carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. Then he looked down at Scout. The German shepherd's tail thumped softly against the floor. Outside, sunlight touched the highest mountain peaks. And for the first time, Caleb knew exactly what he needed to do next. The drive back to Pine Ridge felt different than any journey Caleb had taken since arriving in town. Morning sunlight spilled across the mountains, turning the autumn forest into waves of gold and green stretching toward the horizon. The sealed envelope, the journal, the photograph, and the collection of documents rested carefully inside a weathered leather satchel on the passenger seat. Scout sat beside them, watching the winding road ahead with quiet confidence. The German shepherd seemed unusually relaxed. Whatever had drawn his attention to the fireplace had finally revealed its purpose. Caleb could not stop thinking about the names in the journal. Dozens of families, dozens of stories, ordinary people whose acts of kindness had been quietly forgotten by history. By the time he reached town, the morning rush had already begun. Pickup trucks lined Main Street. Store owners swept sidewalks. Church bells echoed faintly through the crisp mountain air. Yet everything looked slightly different now. Not because the town had changed. Because Caleb had. He parked outside Walter Hayes's office and carried the satchel inside. The attorney looked up from his desk and immediately noticed the expression on Caleb's face. "You found it," Walter said softly. Caleb nodded. For nearly 2 hours, they sat together reviewing every document, every photograph, every journal entry. The older man removed his glasses several times and stared silently at the pages. Occasionally, he shook his head in disbelief. Occasionally, he smiled. When Caleb finally showed him Eleanor's letter addressed to the people of Pine Ridge, Walter remained quiet for a long time. Sunlight streamed through the office windows while dust drifted lazily through the beams of light. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. Finally, Walter spoke. "I wondered if there was more to the story." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "Did you know about any of this?" Walter shook his head. "Only fragments. Rumors. Pieces people stopped talking about years ago." He carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. "Your grandmother trusted you with something important." Caleb stared toward the courthouse across the street. "What do I do with it?" Walter smiled gently. "The same thing she did. Tell the truth. Kindly." The answer felt simple, yet it carried enormous weight. Over the next several days, Walter helped verify names, dates, and records. Old newspaper archives were examined. Church records were reviewed. Historical photographs surfaced from family collections throughout town. Piece by piece, the forgotten story came into focus. The evidence was overwhelming. Eleanor's journal had not exaggerated anything. If anything, it had understated the generosity that carried Pine Ridge through that difficult winter. Word slowly began spreading, first among local historians, then among longtime residents, then throughout the community itself. Curiosity grew with each passing day. Questions followed. Conversations emerged. People began sharing stories passed down from grandparents and great-grandparents. Details hidden for decades suddenly connected like pieces of a puzzle. One afternoon, Caleb walked through town with Scout beside him and noticed something remarkable. Several older residents had gathered outside the diner, discussing names from the journal. They were smiling, laughing, remembering, not arguing, not denying, remembering. The realization brought unexpected peace. The truth was not dividing the town. It was reconnecting it to itself. As the sun began setting behind the mountains that evening, Caleb stood outside the church where his grandmother's funeral had taken place only weeks earlier. Scout sat faithfully beside him. The church bell rang softly across the valley. Somewhere in the distance, smoke rose from chimneys as families gathered for dinner. Caleb looked toward the mountains where the cabin stood waiting beneath the pines. For the first time, he understood why Eleanor had remained there all those years. She had not been protecting a secret. She had been protecting a story until the town was ready to hear it. The town meeting took place on a Thursday evening beneath a sky painted with shades of orange and purple. Autumn had settled fully across the mountains now. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. People began arriving nearly an hour before the meeting was scheduled to start. Pickup trucks filled the parking lot outside the community hall. Families walked together beneath the glow of streetlights. Conversations drifted through the crisp evening air. Curiosity had spread far beyond what Caleb expected. By the time he arrived with Scout, nearly every seat inside the hall was occupied. The German shepherd walked calmly beside him as they entered. Heads turned immediately, not because of Caleb, because everyone knew why he was there. The room buzzed with anticipation. Along the walls hung old photographs of Pine Ridge from previous generations. Some of the faces in those pictures now appeared again inside Eleanor's journal. History seemed to be watching. Walter Hayes stood near the front of the room organizing documents while several church leaders and local historians prepared additional materials. Nobody appeared nervous. Nobody appeared defensive. Instead, there was an unusual feeling in the room. Respect. The kind that appears when people sense they are about to hear something important. Caleb took a seat near the front. Scout settled quietly beside him. The German shepherd's amber eyes moved across the crowd before resting calmly on the stage. As the final conversations faded, Walter stepped forward. Silence settled over the room. Then the story began. For nearly an hour, documents were presented. Photographs were displayed. Journal entries were read aloud. Names that had been forgotten for decades echoed once more through the hall. Some belonged to grandparents. Others belonged to great-grandparents. Several older residents wiped tears from their eyes as familiar family stories suddenly gained new meaning. The photograph from the cabin appeared on a large screen. Eleanor stood among the group exactly as Caleb had first seen her. Young, strong, smiling. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Walter displayed the list of families who helped sustain the town during the winter of 1958. The room became completely still. Many people recognized their family names immediately. Some reached for the hands of spouses. Others simply stared. Generations of quiet sacrifice suddenly stood visible for everyone to see. Yet the most powerful moment arrived near the end. Walter unfolded Eleanor's letter addressed to the people of Pine Ridge and began reading. His voice remained steady throughout. The room listened carefully. No interruptions. No arguments. No distractions. Eleanor's words filled the hall exactly as she intended. She did not accuse anyone. She did not criticize those who shaped the official story. Instead, she honored the ordinary people whose kindness carried others through hardship. She reminded the town that survival had never belonged to one person. It belonged to neighbors helping neighbors, to shared meals, shared firewood, shared hope. By the time the final sentence was read, many faces were wet with tears. Caleb looked around the room and realized something remarkable. Nobody appeared shocked by the truth itself. What moved them was discovering how much goodness had been hidden inside their own history. When the meeting ended, people did not rush toward the exits. They stayed. Families gathered around photographs. Friends compared names from the journal. Grandchildren listened as elderly residents shared stories they had never told before. The room felt warmer somehow. Fuller. More alive. Scout quietly accepted gentle pats from several children who had wandered over to meet him. One elderly woman approached Caleb carrying a faded photograph. She smiled softly before handing it to him. My grandfather spent 3 weeks in that cabin during the storm, she said. He talked about your grandmother until the day he died. Caleb looked at the photograph and felt a lump rise in his throat. Across the hall, dozens of similar conversations were unfolding. The truth had finally returned home. And as the evening drew to a close, Caleb understood something his grandmother had known all along. Some legacies are not measured by what people leave behind. They are measured by what people help others remember. The weeks that followed changed Pine Ridge in ways nobody expected. Autumn slowly surrendered to winter. Frost appeared on rooftops each morning. The mountain peaks gathered fresh snow. Smoke drifted from chimneys throughout the valley while Christmas lights began appearing along Main Street. Yet beneath the familiar rhythms of the season, something deeper was happening. The story hidden for more than 60 years had awakened a part of the town many people did not realize they had lost. Conversations that once lasted minutes now stretched for hours. Families searched through attics and old boxes. Photographs emerged from forgotten albums. Letters were rediscovered. Grandchildren sat beside grandparents listening to stories that had never before been shared. The journal from the cabin became more than a historical record. It became a bridge between generations. Caleb witnessed it everywhere. One afternoon, he stopped at the diner and found 3 tables filled with residents comparing family photographs from the winter of 1958. Another day, he walked past the library and saw volunteers organizing a permanent historical display dedicated to the families mentioned in Eleanor's journal. The project grew larger with each passing week. What surprised Caleb most was how many people wanted to help. Nobody argued over recognition. Nobody demanded credit. They simply wanted the story preserved correctly, exactly as Eleanor had hoped. Scout accompanied him through all of it. The German shepherd quickly became something of a local celebrity. Children waved whenever they saw him. Store owners kept treats behind counters. Elderly residents often knelt beside him and smiled while sharing memories connected to the cabin. More than once, Caleb heard someone jokingly call Scout the town historian. The dog accepted the attention with quiet dignity. Yet despite everything happening in town, Caleb found himself returning to the mountain cabin whenever possible. The place felt different now, not because the mystery had been solved, because he finally understood why it mattered. One snowy evening shortly before Christmas, he sat beside the fireplace while Scout slept near the hearth. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the darkness beyond the windows. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth. The journal rested on the table beside him. Nearby stood several framed copies of the photographs discovered inside the hidden compartment. Caleb stared into the fire and thought about his grandmother. For years, people had described her as quiet, reserved, private. Yet now he realized they had misunderstood her entirely. Eleanor had not withdrawn from the world. She had simply chosen purpose over attention. She never needed recognition because she cared more about preserving truth than receiving praise. The realization humbled him. Earlier that day, Walter Hayes had visited the cabin carrying an unexpected proposal. Several community leaders hoped to create a small historical center inside part of the property. Nothing commercial, nothing elaborate, just a place where future generations could learn about the winter that shaped the town and the people who carried one another through it. Caleb had agreed immediately. It felt right. The cabin had once sheltered neighbors during a crisis. Now it would continue serving the community in a different way. Scout stirred near the fireplace and lifted his head. The German shepherd looked toward Caleb with calm amber eyes. For a moment, neither moved. The fire crackled softly between them. Snow whispered against the windows. Peace settled over the room. Then Caleb glanced toward the section of stone where the hidden compartment had been discovered. A small smile crossed his face. Everyone in town believed the journal had changed Pine Ridge. In truth, none of it would have happened without a dog who refused to ignore something hidden behind a wall. Scout's tail thumped gently against the floor. Outside, the mountain stood silent beneath fresh snow. Inside, the cabin no longer carried a secret. It carried a legacy. And for the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, Caleb no longer felt like a visitor. He felt like he belonged. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains. Snow retreated from the valleys first, then from the forests, and finally from the highest ridges overlooking Pine Ridge. Wildflowers returned to the meadows surrounding the cabin. The streams ran full with snowmelt. Birds nested once more among the towering pines. Life moved forward in the quiet, steady way it always had. Months passed, yet the changes begun by Eleanor's hidden story continued spreading throughout the community. The small historical center inside the cabin opened on a bright Saturday morning beneath clear blue skies. Families arrived from across the valley. Children explored the trails. Grandparents shared memories. Photographs lined the walls beside copies of journal entries and letters preserved behind glass. Nothing about the space felt like a museum. It felt like a home, a place where stories were welcomed instead of stored away. Caleb spent much of the day greeting visitors. Some came to learn about the winter of 1958. Others came simply to see the cabin they had heard so much about. Nearly all of them paused when they reached the display dedicated to the people who carried their neighbors through hardship. There, among dozens of names, they discovered grandparents, great-grandparents, old friends, and forgotten acts of kindness that still echoed through the generations. Scout remained close throughout the day. The German shepherd moved calmly among the visitors, accepting gentle attention from children and warm smiles from elderly residents. More than once, someone pointed toward the fireplace and laughed softly while telling the story of how a dog noticed what generations of people had overlooked. By evening, the last visitors drifted home. The cabin grew quiet once again. Golden sunlight stretched across the porch. The forest glowed beneath the fading light of sunset. Caleb stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. One for himself, the second out of habit before remembering there was nobody left to hand it to. He smiled and set it beside the empty rocking chair that had once belonged to Eleanor. Scout settled at his feet, stretching comfortably across the porch boards warmed by the day's sunshine. Together they watched the valley below. Church bells echoed faintly from town. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. Somewhere far away, laughter drifted across the evening air. Caleb thought about the journey that had brought him here. A funeral, a mysterious inheritance, a forgotten cabin, a hidden compartment concealed behind stone. Through it all, one truth became clear. His grandmother had never wanted him to inherit property. She wanted him to inherit purpose. The cabin was simply the doorway. The real gift was understanding what mattered enough to preserve. The breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers through the clearing. Scout lifted his head toward the wind, then relaxed again. The German shepherd seemed perfectly content. Caleb reached down and rested a hand against the dog's shoulder. "Good job, partner," he said quietly. Scout's tail thumped once against the porch. The sun slipped lower behind the mountains. Shadows lengthened beneath the trees. One by one, lights began appearing throughout the valley below. Caleb looked toward the old stone fireplace visible through the cabin window. Months earlier, it had hidden a secret. Now it stood openly in the center of a home filled with truth. The mountains remained unchanged. The forest remained unchanged. Yet somehow everything felt different. Better. Because the story had finally found its way back to the people who needed it. As twilight settled over the ridges, the first stars appeared above the pines. Caleb sat quietly beside his faithful companion and watched the lights of Pine Ridge shimmer below. The cabin no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to the future. And in that peaceful moment, surrounded by memory, loyalty, and grace, he understood something his grandmother had known all along. The greatest treasures are never the things we keep. They are the things we pass on.